And that's, again, where the guidelines in terms of nutrition focus. Yes, protein is one, but it also really heavily emphasizes whole, real food. Your idea about the word food in general, I think food has kind of come to encompass anything that you could probably put in your mouth that has calorie value to it.
Yeah.
When really we should be looking at food from a perspective of quality. What does it do to our body? It actually makes me think back to when I was early in school. We were talking about some of this processed versus whatever, and cheese was one of the things on the topic, right? And I remember eons ago when, like, Velveeta, right? But they can't legally call it cheese. They ended up calling it cheese food because it wasn't
Or cheese
really,
product, maybe,
or
I think
cheese
is what
product or
yes.
something. Right, exactly. So I think your point is very valid in terms of figuring out, am I getting protein mostly from these supplementals that have been added to a food that is processed to begin with? Or am I sitting down to grilled chicken or salmon or boiled eggs or something like that, and I'm really getting quality because of all the other micronutrients and everything that are in it that also make the protein get absorbed the right way?
Welcome to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, where our goal is to keep you informed, inspired, and a little entertained on all things diabetes. The information contained in this program is based on the experience and opinions of the Integrated Diabetes Services clinical team. Please discuss any changes to your treatment plan with your personal healthcare provider before implementing.
Hi, welcome back to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast. I am Dana Roseman and joined by my very dear friend and colleague, Jenny Smith. We are going to talk a little bit today about the new food guidelines that have been hitting the headlines recently. And just as a quick introduction and reminder, I am a registered dietitian and also a certified care and education specialist and the director of technology and applied research here at Integrated Diabetes. And Jenny, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I am also a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist and the director of lifestyle and nutrition at Integrated Diabetes. And Dana and I have lots and lots of great conversations, not only on our podcast, but also texting and all the emailing. And did you hear about this? So It's nice to have a colleague that is so joined in thought.
Absolutely. And I think today we're just going to really predominantly put our registered dietitian hat and really focus on maybe some of the messaging that has been in the headlines recently with new guidelines as they pertain to nutrition, but also as how they pertain to people living with type 1 diabetes. I think that it's maybe a good place to start with how the guidelines are not necessarily a pyramid anymore as how you and I grew up.
Right. They're not. And we kind of got rid of the pyramid for quite a while because it was not very informative. It wasn't informative in portion. It was confusing as to which foods. And I don't know about you, but I know many times people would look at it and say, well, does this mean I can't eat this? It's not in the picture, or it's not on the pyramid, right? And really,
and we also don't eat in pyramid style, right? I mean, it was just the visual of it was just not, I don't think, informative or intuitive.
No, it wasn't. And then they ended up adding the steps, and the steps didn't help because, right, it was just supposed to incorporate what we encourage anyway, which is added movement, right? Some portion of movement every single day. Get the idea from the knowledgeable who put it together. But really, it didn't mean much for the general public to use, again, in terms of portion. What portion of food? And did you actually work that out in terms of your activity level and your lifestyle needs and any conditions like type 1 that you might be living with, or type 2 diabetes? Does it actually make sense for what you overall need? The one that I really liked was the plate method.
Absolutely.
It was
that
so
visual
easy to see.
Is so nice. And you know what I was thinking about when you were talking about portion sizes is those of us who have had type 1 diabetes for a long time now remember the exchange system.
Yes.
And the old system was very similar in outdated thoughts about the exchange system versus portion size that we, were kind of stuck with in terms of the old guidelines.
Right. But I think even if we look at these new guidelines, right, for the next 5-year time period, we've got these new guidelines that kind of get stuck, and whether people understand how to use them or not, I think the big thing to look at is it sort of goes along with what we were trying to emphasize even with the plate method.
Right.
In the idea of what foods should be going on our plate. What is the priority? And I think, as we were chatting earlier before we got started, it's really the priority seems to be focusing more on protein.
Right. Which I know you and I do quite often with clients just to make sure that we're having protein, complex carbohydrates, and healthy fats. And really, none of that has changed. All of the guidelines, in truth, it's not all that different than it was from the old ones. I think there's just some new focusing and some new branding that makes it look updated and different, and people are concerned that they're maybe not guiding in the newest science.
Right. And if you do actually look what the guidelines actually put out there for now, it does give some clear guideline for protein quantity.
Absolutely. Which I am a huge champion of these changes.
Yes, absolutely. If you don't understand how much you're supposed to eat and you're just being told, hey, just eat more protein. Do you know where the protein sources come from? Do you know that you can get it from a variety of different places? And then for your individual needs, that's where, talking to somebody like a registered dietitian who does navigate diabetes management is very beneficial, because then they can help you figure out from your own personal lifestyle needs, where do you fit in the range, right? Because now it's kind of, the goal is like 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram.
Which if you're in
the States, we measure in pounds. Nobody even knows what their kilogram weight is.
So true. So true. But if you think about it, I mean, the old guidelines were still carryovers from very old nitrogen balance studies.
Yes.
It is completely outdated. And I have been really working with people for a long time to update the intake of their protein, not just for muscle support and wellness, but also for blood sugar management.
Absolutely. When we talk about diabetes, it's one of the huge things that we really emphasize in terms of stabilizing blood sugar, and even in timing those who use insulin with diabetes, right? It's a timing thing. Even though rapid insulin is faster, it's not as fast as we want. So if you've got good protein at a meal, you can always start the meal with the protein, move on to the quantity of like low glycemic, the veggies, and then move on to more of your carbs if you're having them at the same meal time. So it all works out much better.
Yeah, that's my favorite hack too, just changing the order of your plate, which goes back to the plate method, which maybe we'll have to talk about at another time.
Right, exactly. From even an exercise standpoint, and we both work with a lot of women, and women who are now kind of moving beyond the age of 40 and into this time period, that's really important that you know what's going in your body. And protein becomes a really big piece when we're talking about activity. Do you get enough? What type is it? We focus more on resistance training for bone health, etc. But protein intake, and when you're eating it in the day, how much of it, it makes a really big difference.
Yeah, for sure. I like that change. The other change that I have a feeling you're going to be like-minded about, and it does lead into the protein discussion, because I don't know about you, but when I go to the stores now, I mean, there is protein popcorn, there is protein, you name it, it has protein added. My favorite recently that I saw was a protein added sparkling water. And man, they had a sample at the store I was going to. I was dying. I was like, what does this taste like? But, that does lead into the new guidelines for processed food, because, food by definition very often is processed. Food is made up of chemicals. Food is made up of a lot of different things that we metabolize. And so I think we need to have a renewed sense of what is processed food, right? If you can't identify the ingredients, if you know that, your great grandparents just didn't have a clue and eat this
what that
chemical, it's probably of processed food. But in general, so many foods are processed, including things that we take to increase our protein intake. And I wouldn't say those are bad. I would just say that we need to have kind of a reasonable approach to what is a processed food.
Correct. And that's, again, where the guidelines in terms of nutrition focus. Yes, protein is one, but it also really heavily emphasizes whole, real food. Your idea about the word food in general, I think food has kind of come to encompass anything that you could probably put in your mouth that has calorie value to it.
Yeah.
when really we should be looking at food from a perspective of quality. What does it do to our body? It actually makes me think back to when I was early in school. We were talking about some of this processed versus
Mhm.
whatever, and cheese was one of the
Right.
things on the topic, right? And I remember eons ago when, like, Velveeta, right? But they can't legally call it cheese. They ended up calling it cheese food because it wasn't
Or cheese
really,
product, maybe,
or
I think
cheese
is what the,
product or
yes.
something. Right, exactly. So I think your point is very valid in terms of figuring out, am I getting protein mostly from these supplementals that have been added to a food that is processed to begin with? Or am I sitting down to grilled chicken or salmon or boiled eggs or something like that, and I'm really getting quality because of all the other micronutrients and everything that are in it that also make the protein get absorbed the right way?
Right. And I think when we talk about processed food, if you use a little bit of a rational, reasonable approach to it, we know these are cookies, crackers, things in the middle of the grocery store aisles, things that are not on the periphery where we've got the actual foods that you can identify and
Right.
and know the source of them. So
Mhm.
I really am, kind of a fan of that, along with the limit on how much sugar to have during the day. And this absolutely could be linked to processed foods as well.
Mhm.
You know, I think all of us could acknowledge that added sugar can really make type 1 diabetes a little bit challenging. It makes it more of a high glycemic food. We don't get a lot of nutrient energy from that, So I think that we could probably talk about some benefits of that guideline too.
Absolutely. It makes me think too. The other day I saw an advertisement for something that was humorous in terms of protein. This Starbucks ad
Oh,
for
right.
the protein foam on the
Yes.
top
I
of
actually
a
have a friend
drink.
who is very obsessed with that. She actually really, really enjoys it, and she's on a GLP-1, and it's kind of working right now, but, yes.
Well, and as you're talking about
Yeah.
simple sugars and that kind of stuff, okay, you might be getting, let's say, somewhere between 15 and like low 20s in terms of grams of protein. Great, you're getting some protein. Do you know how many teaspoons of sugar went into
Right.
that foamy protein drink that you're
Yes.
drinking?
Yes.
Right? So
Right.
pick
Yeah.
your
There's
foods.
lots of ways to kind of trick, food manufacturers are not necessarily backed in a lot of science. They want to sell
No.
food, and so if you can have sugar with protein but say it's got protein benefits, yeah, sometimes it can be very confusing with that
Yeah. Oh,
message.
yeah. The manufacturers definitely have all
Yeah,
of the fat, protein, sugar. They've got that tied up so well. They know
absolutely.
exactly how to hit the taste buds and
Yeah.
keep you coming back. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
The other kind of big headline guidance that the news, at least, is talking about in terms of these guidelines is in relationship to saturated fat, which hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't. The
Yeah,
guidelines are no different, honestly. And when we talk about limiting the amount of that saturated fat specifically, I think it also is an emphasis on things like there's saturated fat both in animal based products, but also in plant based products,
Yeah,
right?
you make a good point that fats combine polymono and saturated fats kind of not in equal concentrations,
Right.
but they do all, it's hard to find. I don't know if that does happen naturally, that there is a fat that is singular and doesn't include percentages of saturated fat
Of
in the poly and
breakdown.
mono. Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, when you look again, it's also based on saturated fat. How much percent do we need in a
right.
day? And other fats that are not saturated that do have healthy benefit to us. I mean, fat is important. It is, the whole
Absolutely.
fat-free craze, unfortunately, kind of sidelined intake of fat. And what did we get? We got a whole bunch of processed carbohydrate foods,
With
which
more
were
sugar,
with more sugar, which were no better for us. In fact,
right?
were probably a lot worse for us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now we're bringing fats back, but it also just boils down to what is one of the guidelines? The guideline is essentially prioritizing real whole food.
Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, is brought to you by Integrated Diabetes Services, where experience meets expertise, passion meets compassion, and diabetes care is personal because we live it too. Our team of clinicians, all living with type 1 diabetes, understands the challenges firsthand. We're here to help no matter where you are in the world. From glucose management to self-care strategies, the latest tech, sports, and exercise, weight loss, type 1 pregnancy, and emotional well-being, we've got you covered. We offer consultations in English and Spanish via phone, video chat, email, and text. Want to learn more? Visit integrateddiabetes.com or email info@integrateddiabetes.com to schedule a consultation.
If you're going to eat butter, eat butter. Don't eat the pack of stuff in the tub that's just a spread of yellow something.
That sprays.
And the spray, just eat real butter, So it's kind of a breakdown.
With that limit of reducing your total
Of how
calorie
much.
to less than 10% of saturated
Right.
fat. You're not saying to lather butter on every little thing. We're talking about moderation, which quite honestly, registered dietitians have been saying for a long time.
Exactly. Right. I mean, in fats, from all of the other really good sources, things like nuts and seeds and even, coconut and
Right.
avocado.
And these are your mono and polyunsaturated fats that are your healthy fats.
They're healthy fats, absolutely. And again, similar to protein, one, knowing your source, that it's quality and good, adding them to the meals can definitely have a beneficial sort of smoothing effect for blood sugar management.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
don't cut them out, keep them, choose your source well so that it's just an overall benefit to your body to begin with.
Right. And I think, these guidelines can get confusing because I think nutrition science can be confusing.
Yeah.
I get the question very often, well, eggs used to be bad. Now they're good again. And, how do we approach that? And I think it's just so important to understand that nutrition is not one size fits all. And, we
Yep.
need to, especially with type 1 diabetes, we need to approach nutrition as a way to fuel our body and, manage our insulin with it in kind of a unique way for that
Absolutely.
individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody's got, no matter what health condition you're living with, most often people don't live with just one thing.
Right.
So there might be multiple things that you have to learn about within the new guidelines that help you to manage all the pieces of your overall health the best, just from a longevity standpoint.
Yeah. And I wonder if we stop calling them new guidelines, we just say updated, because they're really
Update-
not changing the whole thing except for the direction of that pyramid.
Correct. Exactly. Which I don't even know. Why would you just keep it like a pyramid and just restack it the other way? Right? Isn't that smarter?
It's turning it on its head, perhaps, was the maybe message, but I don't see that it's turning anything on its head all that much.
No, I think what really needs to happen truly is, as should have happened even with the previous models, better education. Right?
Yeah.
Our education should really start in school systems. It should start with, what should your plate look like? And I know that there's actually a lot of question about these updated, I like that term, updated guidelines and what that might mean even in the school systems now. Do they have to transition? Do they have to make some changes to things? And quite honestly, what they could do better is actually start educating kids from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade in terms of, what does this mean? Why are we educating you now, and what does it mean in terms of as you get older and get more into soccer or tennis or ice skating or whatever?
Right.
What does it mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe even add to that why it's important, right? And how you're fueling your body for prevention and management of health over long term. Because I think we can all agree. I think in my elementary school, I had those Nutter Butter wafer bars that were part of the food, and they were delicious, but I think that we could all agree that they weren't part of a healthy meal plan regardless of what the guidelines were.
They were definitely not. No, I mean, I'm sure you probably also had the age-old tater tot casserole, right?
No, we didn't have that.
God, we had real lunch ladies like cooked food.
Sure.
But we had tater tot casserole, and we had did you have the rectangle pizza?
Yes. Obviously, of course. We ought to have just a throw out to those of you who are listening and watching this podcast. What is your most memorable cafeteria food that you had in middle school and high school? Because I feel like people have very favorite ones.
Absolutely.
We had a lot of Frito pie.
Oh, I don't even know what that is.
Yeah, maybe that's just down south. Yeah.
Wow, that's super
I
funny.
didn't eat it, but we had a lot of it.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had Fritos. I know what they are, but I don't know that I've ever had them. The big thing were Funyuns. I don't know.
That is so funny. A friend of mine just recently said that she saves that food for car trips. And I was like, but then everyone in the car is stuck with that smell. And that brings me back to middle school memories.
Absolutely. But again, even the funny things that we're talking about are truly more of like they're processed. What
Those
the
are
components
100% processed.
that, right? You put them all together and they may look like a meal, but really they are all packaged things outside of maybe the green beans in the tater tot casserole
I don't know. And their shelf life is probably, 20 years
forever.
stable. And then we know that that obviously has some unhealthy options that are creating that food for the shelf stability.
Correct. Yeah. I don't think there's in terms of these updates, if anything, again, we need better information about how to use them, how the general public can understand them. And if you are going someplace that is a more convenience place, how do you choose the
Right.
options that are actually will go along with these updates, right? How do you choose this versus what looks a lot more packaged? I could do the nuts from a shelf at a gas station
Right.
versus the donut from the cabinet. Right.
That would be a great swap.
Sure. There you go.
I mean, because I was thinking in my head, real food very often has to have refrigeration. There has to be some sort of protection of that food. And that
Right.
does make it, tricky, but it doesn't necessarily make it more expensive for the consumer. It does make it maybe, there has to be some infrastructure for refrigeration or freezing or something like that,
Right.
or a hot
Right.
plate. So it definitely won't be shelf stable until, the year 2035.
Right. Absolutely. I think the other thing with these updates is it calls out, as the past models should have as well, it calls out an opportunity to have a mindset change
Mm-hmm.
in how you approach your grocery store list or what you pack your pantry with. Even if you took the older guidelines, they still emphasized real food. Unfortunately, it wasn't as well, I guess the information wasn't as well put together. What these guidelines are trying to really define is where should your food come from? And then I think a big one definitely is the protein, which is a lot of people up in an uproar of like,
Right.
what should we
But
be doing?
also, and there is a little bit of a catch up in terms of new science and updated
Yes.
information. But, right now, I think nobody could deny the fact that our society we find food at every place that we go to, gas stations and kiosks and
Yep.
airports. And so I think if and having food so plentiful at different locations that is shelf stable has really lent a kind of tendency for more of it to be processed.
Right. Well, and I think another piece to talking about processed is you could have some foods that have been processed but are not poor options, right?
Right.
One that I think of all the time are beans. I mean, dry beans, they take a long time to, cook and let them hydrate and let them sit overnight and you drain like the whole process is quite time consuming when I buy canned beans, you rinse them off, they're not processed with
No,
like if you look at the
that's a
label,
good
it's just
example of processed, meaning it's still whole foods and not the store,
correct.
but the whole ingredient. And I wish there was a better way to differentiate between processed foods like beans, like cheese, that we are
Right,
absolutely not discouraging, but processed foods that's maybe, a food product and wasn't,
right,
something that was created from just a few ingredients.
right. And I liked your example just earlier about all the foods that are protein now containing. Great, you can buy protein chips that taste like nacho cheese, but that shouldn't really be your meal just because it's got 20 grams worth of protein in it.
Right. Right.
It should be real food, and those might be a handful on the side potentially. But I think, again, it goes along with education and bringing the
Hmm.
information in the right way so the greater majority of our US population can actually benefit from it.
I think this was great and just kind of this was fast and furious and just kind of high level for sure. And so I always welcome people to contact us individually and just get a little bit of a deeper dive, maybe in their nutrition information, maybe in their diabetes management. And that's
Right.
always, kind of how we spend most of our day.
It is absolutely a lot of all of diabetes, food's such a big part of it that
Hmm.
if you need some help with the deeper dive into this and what they actually mean for your individual diabetes management, and life needs, we are certainly here to help. So it's been a pleasure always
Yep.
talking to you
As
about these.
always. And until
Thanks,
next
Dan.
time.
Thanks for tuning in to Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. On behalf of Think Like a Pancreas, the podcast, I'm Gary Shiner, wishing you a fantastic week ahead. And don't forget to think like a pancreas.